Hello, cybersecurity class. Welcome to this week's lecture on international human rights in cyberspace, where we're going to talk about special problems that arise outside of the West. Now, last week we talked about efforts in Western countries, particularly in Europe and Australia, to deal with the problem of violent and terroristic and human trafficking type content. And we also talked in the US about SESTA and FOSTA, and we've talked previously about other efforts in the US to deal with terrorism and other kind of violent content online. So of course we all agree that this kind of criminal content online is a big problem that our society has to confront, but the way to confront it while still preserving our civil liberties and preserving the openness of cyberspace is a really difficult question. And I think this comparison with countries outside the West illustrates why it's a really difficult question. Because what I want you to notice as we look at this is some of the strategies, the legal strategies that are used and the rhetorical strategies that are used by many of these countries to do the kind of really pervasive censorship and really pervasive surveillance that they do. Now, the first thing I wanted to look at generally is a couple of maps that deal with this question of internet freedom. And these are some great reports, a report called Freedom on the Net that's put out by an organization called Freedom House. And we're actually going to have one of the authors of this report talk to us in class on Saturday. So you can find this on their website, and I'll give you a link to the website. So here, I think you can see in really literally graphic detail the differences in internet freedom literally between East and West. So the Western liberal democratic countries, Canada, the US, the European countries, all are in the green, meaning relatively free. Now, of course, if you read the reports on all of those countries, it doesn't mean they don't have their issues and challenges and problems. Of course they do, and we've talked about some of those issues and challenges and problems. But when we look to what we designate as the eastern part of the map, of course, all these terms East and West are relative, but particularly we have Russia, we have China, and we have a number of countries in the Middle East, which by Freedom House are designated as not free, and which have the kind of pervasive surveillance regimes, and we'll look at some of those in some of those countries today. Now, something else to note about this, Freedom House gives the second map here is kind of what they view as the change in the internet freedom score. So what's sort of the trend? And in their view, some of the Western countries, including the US and some of the European countries, are moving away from the regime of freedom that they've had before, and becoming more like some of those Eastern countries. Now, again, I think we can, read these reports and we can reasonably debate some of these conclusions. I think if you read their report on the U.S., one of their big problems with the U.S. has to do with the U.S.'s move away from network neutrality. And I personally would question whether that's really an internet freedom, civil liberties question of the scale that they are suggesting that it is. I think there's reasonable debates about what net neutrality means and what the rules should be and who exactly should regulate it that are a little more complex than they might suggest. But nevertheless, still I think a fair conclusion that there are serious questions in the U.S. and in other Western countries about how we're dealing with some of the legal challenges that we're facing. So what I want to do now is look at some specific countries. The Freedom House, Freedom on the Net reports, there's a general overall report, and then there are reports by country. So I'm drawing the information on the specific countries here from their reports on the specific countries, in some cases supplemented by additional reading of some of the specific laws and statutes that are at issue. So we'll look first at Saudi Arabia. So one thing to note, many of these countries, including Saudi Arabia, are very technologically sophisticated and are very big users of the internet. So Saudi Arabia has 76% internet penetration, 88% is broadband mobile service. There is a 5G network being built out by Ericsson, which is a Western company. There are also agreements with Huawei, which is a Chinese company. Just as a little sort of side note to all of this, and you've probably seen this in the news, but Huawei is a Chinese company that is big on building 5G infrastructure. And not only are they supplying countries like Saudi Arabia, but they're also supplying countries in Europe. And they also had supplied a lot of infrastructure here in the US for building out 5G broadband. And the technology is actually good technology. The concern in some of the Western countries, including in the United States, is that if it's Chinese technology, then it may well have built into it capacities for China to engage in surveillance or cyber attacks on where that equipment is installed. Now, Huawei says, "Hey, we're a commercial company. We're not the Chinese government." But the fact is, companies, Huawei and other Chinese companies, are significantly controlled by the Chinese government. Now, it hasn't been the case, I don't think, that any specific malware or specific spyware has been found in Huawei equipment, but the concern is there, and it's not entirely an unwarranted concern. So the Trump administration has issued an executive order last spring that the United States will no longer buy from Huawei. It was issued under some economic emergency powers laws, as well as other general emergency executive powers. And so it's a pretty extraordinary thing in some ways for the president to say to U.S. companies, you may not use this kind of equipment. It's not unprecedented. These kinds of things do happen. There are other rules, about importation and so on. But this was really a pretty big deal. And a number of agencies, the Commerce Department is coming up with regulations, and the FCC has come up with regulations. And the FCC's regulation about Huawei is controversial, and because it requires existing Huawei equipment to be ripped out and replaced. It's literally called the rip and replace order. And that's pretty costly and a big deal. But that's how serious some of this is taken. In any event, here's Saudi Arabia, big internet use, very technologically sophisticated, also very highly regulated. So one of the themes you'll see in some of these countries in the regulation that they use, there's direct regulation of the infrastructure. So here you have Saudi Arabia through a government agency, the Communications and Information Technology Commission, that has direct regulatory authority over the internet. And that authority includes economic things like price controls. It also includes censorship. So that agency fields removal requests for certain kinds of content. Now, regulation of this sort in the West, certainly not unheard of. Network neutrality is a form of regulation in which, in the U.S., the FCC was given or took regulatory authority over the internet for the purpose of regulating not content directly, but rules about throttling and prioritization of content. And to the extent in the U.S. we have rules like SESTA and FOSTA or other rules that impinge on the Section 230 immunity. And certainly we have rules against, let's say, child pornography, which no one really disputes. Those are content-based. But the content-based regulation in Saudi Arabia goes beyond that kind of content and includes political speech that is unfriendly to the regime, certain kinds of sexual content which wouldn't necessarily be banned as obscenity in Western countries. So one piece is regulation. Another piece is blocking. So the government engages in blocking of certain sites using IP blocking and other blocking techniques. So some voice over IP services are allowed. Some voice over IP services are blocked. Why are some allowed? Those are the ones the government has the ability to easily surveil. So ones that are attempting to circumvent the government's ability to surveil them are blocked. Some social media sites are blocked. Social media sites in Saudi Arabia are not blocked. So Facebook is not blocked, but sometimes they are throttled. The bandwidth speed is throttled. Here, by the way, is an argument that network neutrality rules, at least as applied to the government itself, do promote internet freedom because, without that kind of restriction, the government, if it has the technological capability, can throttle the speed of those sites. News critical of the royal family is sometimes blocked. It's another common theme in many of these countries. Certain kinds of news sites are blocked. Sites of some human rights organizations are blocked. Some content of dissident and minority religious groups is blocked, including some Shiite Islam sites. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Islam country. So some Shiite sites and some other religious sites are blocked. Service providers have to, internet service providers are regulated by the CITC, and they have to respond to blocking requests from the CITC. Again, we saw that in France. There's a similar kind of rule. And Europe is talking about this, 1 hour rule for terroristic content and so on. So those kinds of rules might be a concern per se, or those kind of rules might be a concern depending on the scope of the content the government agency could ask to be blocked. So another theme, so we have a direct regulation blocking. Another theme we'll see is surveillance. So here is a really key thing. Who owns and who controls the internet backbone? In most Western countries, including in the United States, the internet backbone is largely privately owned. And we have noted last semester and throughout this course on national security, the challenges that brings for internet governance and cybersecurity and national security, because you have all this, it's not like the national highway system, which is controlled by the government and which the government can easily, control in the event of an emergency, like shut down a road if there's a major flood or something. That's much more difficult, given that the infrastructure is privately owned. But the other side of that is that if the infrastructure is privately owned, it's more difficult for the government to do direct surveillance of it. In countries like in Saudi Arabia and in some of the other countries we'll look at, the state owns the internet backbone, and it does that on purpose in order to be able to facilitate surveillance and censorship. Individuals who are expressing views in support of liberal democratic ideas or religious reform or minority rights are often tracked and monitored. Many of these sites are monitored. Some of them are blocked. Another piece of this monitoring is at the point of access to equipment. So as we noted, a lot of the internet access in Saudi Arabia is through high-speed mobile connections. If you want a mobile connection, you have to have a SIM card for the phone. If you want a SIM card, a lawfully purchased SIM card in Saudi Arabia, you have to give your fingerprint to the government, and that fingerprint is linked to that SIM card, which enables the government to know the signature of a phone and to tie that to a specific individual. So another piece we'll see here is filtering and removal. There is active filtering in Saudi Arabia. So some sites are blocked. There is also sort of general filters that are trying to filter out certain kinds of content. When we last semester discussed efforts to protect children online in the U.S. And we looked at the Supreme Court cases involving those statutes. And if you remember, in one of the cases, the court said user-generated or user-supplied commercial filtering software could be a good answer because then the user can deploy it. But a government filtering regime under the First Amendment was thought to be problematic. Well, many of these countries directly employ filtering regimes that are trying to keep out content the government doesn't want and are requiring providers to use the government-approved filtering methods. So another theme that we're going to see is many of these countries have adopted anti-terrorism laws. And everyone agrees that terrorism is a significant problem. We, around the world, we have looked at Australia's effort to combat violent and terroristic content online, and Europe's. Some of these other countries are kind of mirroring that. And the question you can ask, and I think very fairly ask, is if the interest of some of these countries, and we'll look at Saudi Arabia, we'll look at Russia, is really about preventing terrorism, or is really using the rhetoric about terrorism as a means of justifying very sweeping surveillance and blocking and monitoring of content that is not, by any definition, really terrorist. Now, that same critique, of course, can be and is often leveled against Western countries, including the U.S., by civil rights groups. The whole rhetoric of the war on terror, justifies Guantanamo Bay and justifies the changes to the FISA statute. Some argue that at least some pieces of some of those things were important to combat terrorism, and some argue that the rhetoric of terrorism was deployed there to promote surveillance. However you view that here in the US or in Europe, you can, I think, very fairly see that in some countries like Saudi Arabia, it's deployed very, very broadly, and that rhetoric is used for surveillance of things that shouldn't be thought of as terrorism. So, look at this definition in this terroristic law. It's not just things we would think of as terrorism, but also anything that brings religion or justice into disrepute. So terrorism could be simply criticizing the Crown Prince. And there have been the Freedom on the Net report details many intellectuals, academics, clerics, members of the ruling family, other people arrested as a result of social media and other activity under these terrorist laws. And of course, we have the example that was in the news last year of the disappearance and the grisly murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who had criticized the royal family. Now let's take a look at Iran. And Iran is an interesting case in the Middle East because what Iran is saying that it's doing is seeking a genuinely halal network aimed at Muslims on an ethical and moral level. So this creates a conflict with Western values about what freedom of speech should mean and what freedom of religion should mean and what the establishment of religion should mean. Iran is a Muslim country and is trying to configure its internet according to its national religious values. You could, of course, look at this a little bit cynically or maybe a little bit clear-eyed and say that this is really a way of kind of the ruling party and the ruling classes of clerics and political leaders to keep control of the population. And I think that's not an unfair read on what is happening. At the same time, I think we do need to try and look at it from the perspective of people within a society that have a genuine religious and political view that is different from our own, and how we might view those differences in light of what they want to do with the internet. Okay, so how does Iran do the censorship and monitoring and filtering and so on that it does? Well, again, the government controls much of the infrastructure, and in particular, there is a state-owned firm in Iran that manages all internet connections going into and coming out of Iran. And I think this is one of the things when we first looked at in the US, the FISA situation after 9/11, and you realize that it was actually technologically possible for the US government to be monitoring, most of the internet traffic coming in and out of the US. It seems like, well, that should be impossible. There's so much traffic. There are so many connections. And while it's true that there is so much traffic and there are so many connections, in terms of, broadband internet traffic, there are limited numbers of cables, undersea cables coming into and out of the country. So the same kind of thing in a country like Iran, there are actually a limited number of places in which broadband connections come in and into and out of the country. And if the government controls those facilities, then the government is going to be able to control all of the connections, which means that the government actually can turn the internet off or can slow the internet down and can inspect the packets coming into and out of the country and do filtering and censorship. Another one of the ways that governments like Iran do this is through something called internet exchange points. So an internet exchange point can be a really useful feature in internet architecture. And throughout the internet architecture in the West, there are any number of important internet exchange points. So these are facilities that are handling large volumes of internet traffic into and out of specific regions or areas. Not every region or area has an internet exchange point, but there are places, for example, outside of London, there's a major internet exchange point that is managed by a private company. Some of these exchange points in the West are managed by private companies. Some of these exchange points are managed by kind of private government cooperatives. Some of them do have some government management. So it can be a very efficient technological way of managing internet traffic, but it can also be a way for a country like Iran to say, we are going to build this internet exchange point, and now all of the high-speed internet traffic comes through these points. It might be various points throughout the country. This allows for throttling and filtering and blocking by the government. So here you see this company, Arapat, in Iran, which is a local government-approved social network site. This is another theme that you're going to see in many of these countries. Social networking is ubiquitous. Some countries will have social network sites that are the only approved sites in the country. Some, like Iran, will allow other social networking sites, but will have a favored government-approved social networking site. And what Iran does is the Arapat site runs on Iranian IXPs. Other social networking sites are filtered and throttled. So again, this is an argument for network neutrality if you think it's inappropriate for the government to favor one social networking site over another. Obviously, the Iranian government favors this one site because it's monitoring the kind of content and the things that are being said on the site. There are also some restrictions in Iran on Western companies that result from economic sanctions back and forth between Iran and the U.S. If you've been following the news at all, you surely know that Iran and the U.S. have actually exchanged some shots fired, so to speak. We seemed like we were almost on the brink of a war not too long ago, which thankfully they have pulled back from. But there are economic sanctions back and forth, and there have been for a long time, though they've intensified. And this also affects the ability of Western social media and internet companies to do business in Iran. Now let's look at North Korea. Not surprisingly, North Korea is another state with very strict and severe control over the internet. To the public global internet, there is some limited access in North Korea, generally in some government offices and to some graduate students in some universities that have some access. But the broader strategy of North Korea is to build its own basically national intranet, and I won't butcher that by trying to pronounce it. But this internal network includes a library of content and a video on demand service, which not surprisingly is pretty much focused on government propaganda. Now we'll look at Russia. So Russia is a very interesting case because to some extent, like Saudi Arabia, it's adopting some of the rhetoric of fighting terrorism and fighting hate speech and so on in ways that seem to go far beyond what we would think of as appropriate to that in a Western democracy. The Russian Yarovaya law is one that many internet civil liberties activists outside of Russia have criticized. So has a number of features. Users of social media and communication apps have to register their phone numbers with the government, which would make it easier for the government, of course, to track those users. Just as encryption is an issue here in the United States, that same kind of rhetoric is adopted in Russia, and online services that offer encryption have to be able to assist authorities to decode in encrypted data and to share decryption keys with the authorities. There is also a regulatory licensing regime through which the Russian government exercises control over the internet, this System for Operational Measures, or SORM. So to receive a license to operate as an ISP, the ISP has to install equipment that allows the government to monitor traffic. The Russian government is also doing this for Internet of Things platforms as well. Under Russian law, there is no warrant at all required to intercept communications to ISPs. So as we've looked at this here in the US, we have looked at the Wiretap Act, and we have also looked at the Stored Communications Act, and we looked at the Carpenter case. So we've talked about the challenges under U.S. law and the third-party doctrine for access to service providers, and we'll talk a little bit more about it also in the second part of this semester. But we see here in Russia, the government has access to the equipment. There's no warrant or court order required at all. 2019, Russia adopted something called the Sovereign Internet Bill. So this is adopting that page in the playbook of using internet exchange points, IXPs. And so the internet exchange points here, so in Russia here, it requires an ISP to interconnect at a government-controlled exchange point, which then, of course, gives the government abilities to monitor, filter, block, and throttle. The last country report that we'll look at here is China. And, no surprise, I think, to us that China is a pervasive surveillance state and exercises extensive control over its internet. So it is adopting really all of the tactics we've talked about and more. One of them is regulatory. So the Cyberspace Administration of China, or CAC, is the principal regulator in China. You have probably heard the phrase "the Great Firewall" in China, and that is a thing. So the Great Firewall is really not just one thing, but it is multiple measures that the Chinese government takes through the CAC and otherwise to monitor, to filter, and to block. And so in particular, China blocks Google, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, the New York Times, more than 13,000 different sites, mostly Western social media news and search type sites. The Great Firewall also uses packet inspection, blacklisting, as well as human monitors. And one of the videos that extra videos that I gave you to watch this week is actually a pretty interesting interview with a Chinese internet monitor. And I think when you watch that video, get a feel for how that person sees his job and how he sees his role in that society. It gives you a really interesting perspective on how he thinks about it. Here is one site that gives a list of some sites and terms that have been blocked by the Great Firewall. If you kind of look down the list of these terms, you can see sort of the political issues, China's dispute with Tibet, democracy, dissent, and a bunch of other things. Like some of the other countries we've looked at, China has government-approved platforms for chat and for social media and search. So Weibo and WeChat are the approved platforms. And these platforms are significantly controlled by the government and cooperate directly with the authorities. Not only are these things monitored by the authorities, but in China, the trends on social media are actually manipulated by the censors. There are armies of paid social media influencers who are, and you've heard that term here in the US, a company pays someone who has a popular YouTube channel or something to promote their product. Well, in China, there are people paid by the government to comment, giving government-approved positions and so on. And there are also people that do this as a volunteer thing on behalf of the government, motivated by their belief or their ideology. The CAC has specific regulations that monitor news sites. Another big debate that you've probably heard about in the news is, the extent to which a Western company should agree to play ball in China. There was a period during which Google took a lot of criticism because it initially had agreed to some of the Chinese censorship rules in order to do business in China. And that, raises a bunch of challenging questions for the role of a technology company like that. They're, of course, not a government. They're not governed by a constitution. They presumably are in business to, make a return for their shareholders, although they also presumably, hopefully, have some values that they run their business by. And, if you're going to do business in any country, you have to abide by that country's laws, some of which you may not like. So how far does a company like a Google or another social media company go? And that's a big debate. China, like Saudi Arabia and other countries that aggressively censor the internet, also do this in a very direct way by persecuting, harassing, arresting, and so on, journalists and also religious and ethnic minorities. One of the other videos on China that I posted for you more broadly about China's surveillance state, because this is not just sort of internet surveillance, but China has deployed and is deploying this broad network of cameras, facial recognition, other AI systems to be able to monitor people's whereabouts, location, activities, and so on. And one of the ways in which they're deploying it is against the Uyghur ethnic and religious minority, which is a minority that hails mostly from the sort of western part of China that is a Muslim and ethnically different than sort of the mainland Chinese. And, there's sort of just massive human rights violations against the Uyghurs in China, and part of that is connected with this internet surveillance. In addition to the Great Firewall, China deploys something called the Great Cannon, which is actually an offensive cyber capacity. So we of course know that the Chinese government, the Chinese military, other Chinese actors are engaged in cyber espionage, cyber surveillance, influence campaigns, data breaches, and so on in Western countries, including in particular in the US. But the Great Cannon is a way of launching large-scale denial of service attacks by targeting web traffic that might be attempting to get through the Great Firewall. China is also using the problem and the rhetoric of cybersecurity to promote its internet surveillance campaign. And this, again, is not necessarily a problem confined to non-Western countries. All of this stuff we've been studying over the past couple semesters about computer crime and cybersecurity are in the US are efforts to address those problems here. And many of them, as we have seen, face criticism from civil liberties activists as going too far and as using the problem of cybersecurity as a way of exerting more government control. And indeed, there's always this balance between liberty and security. Security always is going to entail some degree of, at least in the short run, diminishing liberty. Of course, there is no liberty without security. So it's not like you can have a perfectly libertarian state in which there is no rule of law at all, given the reality of human nature. But countries like China, it fairly can be said, deploy their cybersecurity laws and the rhetoric of cybersecurity in some pretty strong ways. So here's a few pieces. There's a lot of things in China's cybersecurity law that you wouldn't find necessarily difficult or challenging about network resilience and preventing crime and so on. But there are other things that certainly raise eyebrows from our American perspective. So, the state advocates a certain kind of online conduct. Network operators are required to protect cybersecurity, but also to accept supervision from the government and public and to bear social responsibility. Persons who are using a network that endanger cybersecurity, endanger national security or national honor or national interests, or incite subversion of national sovereignty or overturn the socialist system, incite separatism, break national unity. This kind of language obviously is the kind of language that concerns Western civil libertarians, and that is often used to suppress dissent. Again, trying to be a little bit fairer, to live in a little bit the Chinese perspective, which maybe this is the society we envision for ourselves and that we're trying to build, and there's a certain kind of speech or conduct that we see as really undermining our society that we want to correct. And the same is true, for you Americans. There's certain kinds of hates, or you Europeans, there's certain kinds of things you consider hate speech. There's certain kinds of things you consider terrorist speech. You want to limit those things, and you might have laws that, in fact, impose some liability or some culpability to limit those things. Our response to that might be, well, yes, but we're not going as far as you are in suppressing political commentary or political dissent. And, that's the big debate in the difference really between these systems and the ways in which these laws are deployed. The Chinese cybersecurity law also requires that infrastructure operators, the providers of internet service and mobile service, obtain real personal information of anybody who is using their sites, so that those people, and to localize that data within mainland China. So that idea of real identity information, which again is not entirely foreign. An internet service provider here in the U.S., wants to have the real information of who its subscribers are and needs to do business. But really, this is getting at the possibility of remaining anonymous on the internet in China. And then data localization is often promoted by countries like China as a cybersecurity measure, because if the data is not escaping outside the country, it's less apt to be lost or compromised or stolen, the argument goes. But of course, data localization is also a way of the government having access to and controlling all of the data that is generated in that country, and of prohibiting somebody from trying to avoid government surveillance by storing data somewhere else. Finally, the Chinese cybersecurity law imposes obligations on network operators to respond to government requests and to expeditiously deter or prevent the spread of or stop information that violates the cybersecurity law. Again, do we have things like that in Western law and even in American law? We do have some things like that, certainly for, again, things like child pornography. It's contraband. If you're a provider, you discover it, you have to remove it. Europe, the terrorism and hate speech laws. So what are the values? How far do those laws extend? How are they applied? Those are some of the big questions that we'll discuss when we have our summit meeting and we actually talk with one of the people who helped write these reports.